The Hartley mansion loomed over the quiet suburban neighborhood like an ivory fortress, its manicured lawns and gleaming windows a stark contrast to the modest homes surrounding it. Inside, Richard Hartley sat in his mahogany-paneled study, frowning at the quarterly reports spread across his antique desk. The numbers were good, they always were, but for Richard, they were never quite good enough. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "What is it?" he snapped, not bothering to look up. His housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, poked her head in. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Hartley, but there's a woman at the door asking to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Richard's frown deepened. He didn't have time for unexpected visitors, especially not on a Saturday afternoon. "Tell her I'm busy," he said curtly, waving a dismissive hand. Mrs. Simmons hesitated. "Sir, she seems quite desperate. She has 2 young children with her, and they look like they could use a good meal." For a moment, something flickered in Richard's cold gray eyes, a ghost of emotion quickly extinguished. "Fine," he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Send them in, but make it quick." A few moments later, a haggard-looking woman entered the study, clutching the hands of 2 small children. The boy, no more than 6, stared wide-eyed at the opulent surroundings. The girl, a toddler with a mop of unruly curls, clung to her mother's leg, thumb firmly planted in her mouth. "Mr. Hartley," the woman began, her voice trembling. "My name is Sarah Thompson. I hate to bother you like this, but I didn't know where else to turn." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, regarding the trio with thinly veiled impatience. "What is it you want, Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah swallowed hard. "It's about the old community center on Elm Street. I heard you bought the property last month." "That's correct," Richard replied, his tone clipped. "What of it?" "Well, sir, that center has been a lifeline for so many families in this neighborhood. It provides after-school programs, meals for low-income families, job training." Richard held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm aware of the center's functions, Mrs. Thompson. I'm also aware that it's been operating at a loss for years. It's not a sustainable business model." Sarah's face fell. "But it's not meant to be a business, Mr. Hartley. It's a community resource. Without it, so many of us will struggle to." "I'm sorry," Richard interrupted, not sounding sorry at all. "But I've already made my decision. The property will be developed into luxury condominiums. It's a much more profitable use of the land." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "Please, Mr. Hartley, we're not asking for handouts. We just need a little more time to find alternative resources. If you could delay the demolition for even a few months." "Absolutely not," Richard said firmly. "The plans are already in motion. Now, if that's all, I have work to attend to." The little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, though not quietly enough, "is the mean man going to take away Miss Jenny's art class?" Sarah hushed him gently, but Richard's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Thompson, I've made my position clear. I won't be changing my mind, so I suggest you start looking for other options. Good day." As Mrs. Simmons ushered the dejected family out, Richard turned back to his reports, pushing away the nagging discomfort in the pit of his stomach. He was a businessman, after all. Sentimentality had no place in his world. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls as Richard threw himself into work, determined to forget about Sarah Thompson and her pleading eyes. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a crisp autumn evening when Richard found himself stuck in traffic on his way home from the office. Drumming his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel of his luxury sedan, he glanced out the window and froze. There, on the sidewalk, was Sarah Thompson. She was struggling to balance a stack of flyers in one arm while keeping a grip on her daughter's hand. The little boy trailed behind, looking tired and hungry. Before Richard could look away, Sarah's eyes met his through the car window. For a moment, neither moved. Then, to Richard's surprise, Sarah's face broke into a warm smile. She waved, gesturing for him to roll down his window. Bewildered and more than a little wary, Richard complied. "Mrs. Thompson," he said stiffly. "What a surprise." Sarah's smile didn't waver. "Mr. Hartley, I'm so glad I ran into you. I wanted to thank you." Richard blinked. "Thank me? For what?" "For motivating us," Sarah replied, her eyes shining with a determination that hadn't been there during their first encounter. "After our meeting, I realized we couldn't just sit back and wait for someone else to solve our problems. So, we've been organizing." She handed him one of the flyers. Richard glanced down at it, reading the bold headline, "Community Unites to Save Elm Street Center." Sarah continued, her voice growing more animated. "We've started a crowdfunding campaign, reached out to local businesses for sponsorships, and even got a pro bono lawyer to look into our options. It's been amazing to see everyone come together like this." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. "I see," he said slowly. "And you think this will change anything?" Sarah's smile softened. "Maybe not. But even if we can't save the center, we've discovered something more valuable, the strength of our community. And that's something no one can take away from us." As if on cue, the little boy piped up. "Yeah, and I made a new friend at the bake sale we had last week. His name is Tommy, and his dad owns a construction company. He said maybe they could help fix up the center so it doesn't have to be torn down." Richard found himself at a loss for words. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even threats. But this unshakable optimism in the face of adversity, it was unlike anything he had encountered in his cutthroat business world. "Mr. Hartley?" Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I know you're a busy man, but if you ever want to see what the center means to us, you're welcome to stop by any time. We're having a community dinner there tomorrow night. Everyone's welcome." Before Richard could respond, the traffic ahead began to move. Sarah stepped back, waving goodbye as Richard's car inched forward. He watched in the rearview mirror as she and her children continued down the sidewalk, distributing flyers with unwavering enthusiasm. For the rest of the drive home, Richard couldn't shake the image of Sarah's determined smile from his mind. It stirred something long dormant within him, a memory of a time when he, too, had faced seemingly insurmountable odds with nothing but hope and determination. As he pulled into the circular driveway of his mansion, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. Tomorrow night, he would accept Sarah's invitation. He told himself it was merely to assess the situation firsthand, to gather more information before proceeding with his plans. But deep down, in a part of himself he rarely acknowledged, Richard Hartley knew he was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, community, and the true measure of a person's worth. The next evening, Richard found himself standing in front of the Elm Street Community Center, feeling oddly out of place in his tailored suit. The building was older than he remembered, its paint peeling in places, but there was a warmth emanating from within that had nothing to do with temperature. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him was a far cry from the sleek corporate gatherings he was accustomed to. The community center's main hall was filled with long tables covered in mismatched tablecloths. The air was thick with the aroma of home-cooked meals and the sound of laughter. People of all ages milled about, chatting animatedly and helping themselves to an eclectic array of dishes. For a moment, Richard stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sheer vitality of the place. Then, a familiar voice called out to him. "Mr. Hartley, you came." Sarah Thompson approached, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "We're so glad you could join us." Richard cleared his throat, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Yes, well, I thought it prudent to see things for myself." Sarah nodded, seemingly unfazed by his formal tone. "Of course. Please let me show you around." As they made their way through the crowded room, Sarah pointed out various activities and introduced Richard to a parade of community members. There was Miss Jenny, the art teacher, proudly showcasing a wall of children's paintings. Mr. Rodriguez, a former accountant who now taught financial literacy classes to adults trying to get back on their feet. Mrs. Chun, who ran the center's small but well-loved library. Each person greeted Richard with a mix of surprise and cautious hope. He found himself shaking more hands than he had in years, listening to story after story of how the center had changed lives. "And over here," Sarah said, leading him to a corner where a group of teenagers huddled around computers, "is our tech lab. It's not much, but it's where many of our kids get their first exposure to coding and digital skills." One of the teens, a girl with bright blue hair, looked up. "Hey, you're the guy who wants to tear this place down, right?" Her tone was more curious than accusatory. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Yes, that's me." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I learned how to build websites here. Now I'm helping local businesses get online. It's not much, but it's a start. Maybe I'll be running my own tech company someday, like you." Her words hit Richard like a physical blow. He saw himself in her determined gaze, a younger, hungrier version of himself, before success had hardened his heart. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself drawn into conversations he never expected to have. He listened to single mothers talk about how the center's childcare program allowed them to work and provide for their families. He watched elderly residents teach chess to wide-eyed children. He even tasted Mrs. Patel's famous curry, which she insisted he try despite his protests that he wasn't hungry. Throughout it all, Sarah remained by his side, a quiet but constant presence. She didn't push or plead, simply allowing Richard to absorb the vibrant tapestry of community life unfolding around him. It was nearing the end of the night when Sarah's son, Ethan, tugged on Richard's sleeve. "Mr. Hartley, can I show you something?" Surprised, Richard nodded, following the boy to a bulletin board near the entrance. It was covered in colorful post-it notes, each bearing a handwritten message. "We call it the Dream Board," Ethan explained proudly. "Everyone writes down their goals and sticks them up here. Miss Jenny says it's important to visualize our dreams." Richard scanned the notes, a lump forming in his throat as he read. "Graduate high school and be the first in my family to go to college. Open my own bakery. Learn to read so I can tell bedtime stories to my grandkids. Find a job that lets me provide for my family. And there, in childish scrawl, become a businessman like Mr. Hartley, but use my money to help people. Richard turned to find Ethan beaming up at him. That one's mine, the boy said. Mom says you're really successful. I want to be like that too, but I also want to make sure places like this stay open. Do you think that's possible? For the first time in years, Richard Hartley found himself truly speechless. He looked around the room, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a building or a failed business model. It was a lifeline, a launching pad for dreams, a place where hope flourished against all odds. As he struggled to find words, Sarah approached, resting a hand on her son's shoulder. It's getting late, Ethan. Why don't you go help Mrs. Chin clean up the library? Once the boy had scampered off, Sarah turned to Richard, her expression gentle but resolute. Mr. Hartley, I want to thank you again for coming tonight. I know this probably isn't what you expected. Richard shook his head, still reeling from the evening's revelations. No, he said quietly. It certainly isn't. Sarah took a deep breath. I know you have plans for this property, and I understand that business is business. But I hope tonight has shown you that what happens here, it's more than just numbers on a balance sheet. It's people's lives, their futures. She gestured around the room, where volunteers were starting to clean up. We're not asking for charity, Mr. Hartley. We're willing to work hard, to find solutions. All we're asking for is a chance. Richard stood silent for a long moment, his mind racing. Everything he had built his life around, the pursuit of profit, the cold logic of business decisions, seemed to be crumbling in the face of this simple truth, that true wealth wasn't always measured in dollars and cents. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah, I think it's time we had a real conversation about the future of this center. Sarah's eyes widened with hope. You mean? Richard nodded slowly. I mean, I may have been too hasty in my decision. Perhaps there's a way we can work together to find a solution that benefits everyone. The smile that broke across Sarah's face was like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds. Mr. Hartley, you have no idea what this means to us. Thank you for giving us a chance. As they walked towards his car, Richard felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the next business deal or profit margin. Please, he said as he opened his car door, call me Richard. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Richard threw himself into the challenge of saving the Elm Street Community Center with the same vigor he usually reserved for high-stakes business deals. He assembled a team of his best financial advisors and legal experts, working alongside the community members to explore every possible avenue. It wasn't easy. There were late nights poring over budgets, heated debates about feasibility, and moments when it seemed like they were fighting a losing battle. But with each obstacle they faced, Richard found himself more determined to succeed. He reached out to his vast network of business contacts, securing donations and sponsorships. He worked with local government officials to explore tax incentives and grants. And perhaps most surprisingly to those who knew him, Richard dipped into his own considerable fortune to establish an endowment for the center's long-term sustainability. As word spread about Richard Hartley's change of heart, the media caught wind of the story. Journalists clamored for interviews, wanting to know what had caused this apparent transformation in the notoriously ruthless businessman. Richard deflected their questions with a newfound humility. "I'm not the story here," he'd say. "It's the people of this community who deserve the credit. They showed me what true resilience and determination look like." Sarah Thompson became his right hand in the revitalization efforts. Her unwavering optimism and deep understanding of the community's needs proved invaluable. Together, they crafted a plan that would not only save the center but expand its services and reach. One crisp morning, 3 months after that fateful community dinner, Richard stood before a crowd gathered in front of the Elm Street Community Center. The old building had been given a fresh coat of paint, and a new sign proudly proclaimed it as the Hartley-Thompson Community Hub. As Richard stepped up to the podium to give his speech, he caught Sarah's eye in the front row. She gave him an encouraging nod, and he felt a surge of confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and clear. "A few months ago, I stood on this very spot with very different intentions. I saw this place as nothing more than a business opportunity, a chance to turn a profit. I couldn't have been more wrong." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces that had become familiar to him over the past weeks. Faces that now looked at him not with fear or resentment, but with hope and trust. This center, this hub, is more than just a building. It's the heart of a community, a place where dreams are born, where lives are changed, and where the true meaning of success is measured not in dollars, but in the impact we have on each other's lives. Richard's voice grew passionate as he continued. "I've learned more in these past few months than I have in years of boardroom meetings. I've learned that true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you give. I've learned that when we come together, when we support each other, there's no challenge we can't overcome." He gestured to the newly renovated building behind him. "This hub will continue to provide all the services it always has: childcare, job training, educational programs, and more. But it will also expand, offering new opportunities for this community to grow and thrive." Richard outlined the plans they had developed: a state-of-the-art computer lab, a small business incubator, expanded health services, and a scholarship program for local students. With each announcement, the crowd's excitement grew. "None of this would have been possible without the tireless efforts of so many people," Richard said, his voice softening. "But there's one person in particular who deserves recognition. Someone who had the courage to stand up to me, to show me what really matters. Sarah Thompson, would you please join me up here?" A surprised murmur ran through the crowd as Sarah, blushing furiously, made her way to the podium. Richard stepped aside, gesturing for her to speak. Sarah looked out at the gathered community, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know what to say," she began hesitantly. "When I first knocked on Mr. Hartley's door all those months ago, I never imagined we'd end up here. But I knew that if we just held on to hope, if we worked together, we could make a difference." She turned to Richard, her smile radiant. "Mr. Hartley, Richard, thank you for listening. Thank you for giving us a chance. And thank you for showing us that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become a force for good in the world." As the crowd erupted in applause, Richard felt a warmth spreading through his chest. He realized that for the first time in years, he felt truly, deeply happy. Not the fleeting satisfaction of closing a big deal or acquiring a new property, but a profound sense of fulfillment that came from making a real difference in people's lives. The rest of the day passed in a blur of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, tours of the new facilities, and celebrations. As evening fell, Richard found himself back in the main hall, now transformed into a gleaming multipurpose space. The room was filled with laughter and music as community members of all ages danced and enjoyed refreshments. He spotted Ethan, Sarah's son, showing off his new tablet to a group of awestruck friends. The devices had been part of the tech lab upgrade, ensuring that every child in the community had access to the tools they needed to succeed in the digital age. Quite a change from a few months ago, isn't it? Sarah's voice came from behind him. Richard turned to find her smiling up at him, her eyes twinkling. "Indeed it is," he agreed, returning her smile. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you, Sarah. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." Sarah shook her head. "I believe there's good in everyone, Richard. Sometimes it just takes a little reminder to bring it out." As they stood there, watching the joyful scene before them, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that his life would never be the same after this, and he was grateful for it. "So," Sarah said, a hint of mischief in her voice, "what's next for Richard Hartley, community champion?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. Whatever it is, it'll be about more than just making money. It'll be about making a difference." As the night wore on and the celebration continued around them, Richard Hartley, once known as the coldest businessman in town, found himself surrounded by warmth, laughter, and a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in decades. He realized that in trying to help this community, he had found something he didn't even know he was missing, a purpose greater than himself, and a new definition of true success. And as he looked out at the faces of those whose lives he had touched, and who had, in turn, touched his, Richard knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter filled with hope, compassion, and the unshakable belief that when people come together, anything is possible. The story of the Elm Street Community Center, now the Hartley Thompson Community Hub, would be told for years to come. It would inspire other communities to fight for what mattered and remind other business people that there was more to life than the bottom line. But more than that, it would stand as a testament to the power of second chances, the strength of community, and the transformative nature of kindness. For Richard Hartley, it was the beginning of a journey he never expected to take, a journey that would lead him to redefine his legacy, not as a titan of industry, but as a man who learned that the greatest wealth comes from enriching the lives of others. And as he stood there, surrounded by the warmth of his new extended family, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. As the weeks turned into months, the Hartley Thompson Community Hub became a beacon of hope and progress in the neighborhood. Richard found himself spending more and more time there, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely enjoyed being part of the vibrant community he had once sought to displace. One crisp autumn morning, almost a year after that fateful community dinner, Richard arrived at the hub earlier than usual. He had a meeting scheduled with Sarah to discuss some new program ideas, but as he walked through the doors, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. The main hall was filled with people, all busy at work on what appeared to be a massive art project. Colorful paper chains draped from the ceiling, handmade posters covered the walls, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh paint and the sound of laughter. "Richard," Sarah called out, waving him over. She was helping a group of children assemble what looked like a giant papier-mâché globe. "You're early. We weren't expecting you for another hour." Richard raised an eyebrow, taking in the scene. Clearly, what's all this about? Sarah's eyes twinkled with excitement. "It's for the Hub's one-year anniversary celebration next week. We wanted to surprise you, but, well, surprise." A warm feeling spread through Richard's chest. He had been so focused on the day-to-day operations and future plans for the Hub that he hadn't even realized the anniversary was approaching. "Can I help?" He found himself asking, surprising even himself with his eagerness. Sarah's smile widened. Of course. Grab a paintbrush. We're working on a mural that showcases all the ways the hub has impacted our community this past year. For the next few hours, Richard lost himself in the joy of creation. He painted alongside children and seniors, laughing at his own clumsy attempts to keep up with their artistic skills. He listened to stories of lives changed, dreams realized, and hope restored, all because of the place he had once sought to destroy. As lunchtime approached, the delicious aroma of home-cooked food began to fill the air. Mrs. Patel, whose curry had made such an impression on Richard that first night, had taken charge of the hub's expanded culinary program. She now offered cooking classes and ran a small catering business out of the hub's industrial kitchen. Mr. Richard, she called out, waving a wooden spoon. Come, come. You must taste this new recipe. I think it will be perfect for the celebration. Richard obediently made his way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Patel promptly handed him a steaming bowl of something that smelled divine. As he took a bite, flavors exploded on his tongue, a perfect blend of spices, vegetables, and tender meat. This is incredible, Mrs. Patel, he said, meaning every word. What do you call it? The older woman beamed with pride. I call it community stew. A little bit of everything coming together to make something wonderful, just like our hub. As Richard savored the meal, he couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed in the past year. The man he had been, focused solely on profit margins and business expansion, seemed like a stranger now. After lunch, Richard found himself drawn into a lively debate with some of the hub's teenage entrepreneurs. They were discussing the ethics of artificial intelligence and its potential impact on future job markets. Richard was impressed by their knowledge and passion, realizing that these young minds were the future leaders who would shape the world long after he was gone. As the day wore on, Richard noticed Sarah deep in conversation with a woman he didn't recognize. The stranger seemed agitated, gesticulating wildly as she spoke. Concerned, Richard made his way over to them. Is everything all right? He asked as he approached. Sarah turned to him, her expression a mix of worry and determination. Richard, this is Amanda. She's from the Oakwood neighborhood, about 20 miles from here. Amanda nodded curtly, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. Mr. Hartley, I've heard about what you did here. I came because, well, we need your help. Over the next hour, Amanda explained her situation. The Oakwood community was facing a crisis similar to what Elm Street had faced a year ago. A large corporation had bought up several blocks of property, including their local community center, with plans to develop high-end retail spaces and luxury apartments. The center is all some of us have, Amanda said, her voice cracking. It's where our kids go after school, where people learn English, where we have our food bank. If it closes, I don't know what we'll do. Richard listened intently, feeling a mixture of empathy and, was that guilt? He recognized the corporate tactics Amanda described. They were strategies he himself had employed countless times in the past. As Amanda finished her story, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He could easily dismiss her plea, rationalize that he had already done his part with the Elm Street hub. But as he looked around at the vibrant community he had become a part of, he knew he couldn't turn his back on another group in need. Amanda, he said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. I think I might be able to help, but it's going to take more than just me. It's going to take all of us. He turned to Sarah, seeing the same determination reflected in her eyes. What do you say? Ready to take the hub's mission on the road? Sarah's face broke into a wide grin. I thought you'd never ask. Over the next few weeks, As preparations for the hub's anniversary celebration continued, Richard and Sarah worked tirelessly to develop a plan for Oakwood. They reached out to their network of business contacts, leveraging the success story of the Elm Street Hub to garner support for this new endeavor. Richard even arranged a meeting with the CEO of the corporation planning to develop Oakwood. It was a surreal experience, sitting across the table from a man who reminded him so much of his former self. But armed with the lessons he had learned and the passion he had discovered, Richard was able to make a compelling case for preserving and revitalizing the Oakwood Community Center. The night before the hub's anniversary celebration, Richard found himself back in the main hall, surrounded by the colorful decorations and handmade banners. Sarah joined him, both of them taking a moment to appreciate the fruits of their labor. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Sarah asked softly. Richard shook his head, a smile playing at his lips. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times, it's like I've lived a whole lifetime since then." Sarah nudged him gently with her elbow. "You know, when I first knocked on your door, I never imagined we'd end up here. I was so scared, so desperate, but something told me not to give up." "I'm glad you didn't," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed my life, Sarah. You showed me what really matters." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, taking in the transformation of the space and of themselves. "So," Sarah said finally, a hint of excitement in her voice, "are you ready for tomorrow? And for everything that comes after?" Richard thought about the celebration awaiting them, about the plans for Oakwood, about the countless other communities that could benefit from what they had learned. He thought about the journey he had been on, from a man focused solely on wealth accumulation to someone dedicated to creating real, lasting change in the world. "You know what?" he said, turning to Sarah with a grin. "I think I am. In fact, I can't wait to see what we'll accomplish next." As they left the hub that night, Richard Hartley felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be challenges and setbacks along the way. But he also knew that with the strength of community behind him, with the lessons he had learned and the passion he had discovered, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The story of the Hartley-Thompson Community Hub was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold, reaching out to touch more lives, inspire more change, and prove that when people come together with hope and determination, anything is possible. And for Richard Hartley, once known as the coldest businessman in town, it was the start of a new chapter, one filled with purpose, compassion, and the joy of making a real difference in the world. As he drove home under the starlit sky, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to grow, learn, and give back to the community that had given him so much. The tale of the rich man who denied a poor family help, only to be left speechless by their response, had transformed into something far greater. It had become a story of redemption, of second chances, and of the incredible power of human kindness and perseverance. And as the Hartley-Thompson Community Hub prepared to celebrate its first anniversary, it stood as a shining example of what can happen when people choose hope over cynicism, community over isolation, and love over indifference. The journey that had begun with a desperate knock on a door had led to a transformation not just of a building or a neighborhood, but of hearts and minds. And for Richard Hartley, Sarah Thompson, and countless others whose lives had been touched by the hub, it was only the beginning of a beautiful, inspiring story that would continue to unfold for years to come. As the sun rose on the day of the hub's anniversary celebration, the entire neighborhood buzzed with excitement. The streets leading to the hub were lined with colorful banners and balloons, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aromas of Mrs. Patel's famous community stew and other culinary delights prepared for the occasion. Richard arrived early, his heart swelling with pride as he watched volunteers scurrying about, putting the final touches on the decorations. He spotted Ethan, Sarah's son, now a confident young teenager, directing a group of his peers as they set up a tech demonstration in one corner of the main hall. "Mr. Hartley," Ethan called out, waving enthusiastically. "Come check this out." Richard made his way over, curious to see what the young man had been working on. Ethan proudly showed off a website he and his friends had created, showcasing the hub's journey over the past year. It was filled with before and after photos, success stories, and even a virtual tour of the facilities. "This is incredible, Ethan," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "You've really put your tech skills to good use." Ethan beamed. "Thanks. We're hoping to use this as a template to help other communities start their own hubs. Maybe even the one in Oakwood." Richard felt a surge of emotion at the boy's words. The impact of their work was spreading further than he could have ever imagined. As the morning progressed, people began to flood into the hub. Families, seniors, local business owners, and even a few curious onlookers from neighboring towns all came to celebrate the hub's success and the transformation of their community. Sarah found Richard amidst the crowd, her face glowing with happiness. "Can you believe this turnout?" she said, gesturing to the packed hall. "I think we might need a bigger venue next year." Richard chuckled, shaking his head in wonder. "If you had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here today, surrounded by all this." He trailed off, overcome by emotion. Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "You've come a long way, Richard. We all have." As they made their way through the crowd, Richard was stopped every few steps by someone wanting to share a story or express their gratitude. There was Mrs. Chen, proudly announcing that her adult literacy program had helped 20 people earn their high school equivalency diplomas. Mr. Rodriguez, the financial literacy teacher, introduced Richard to a young couple who had just bought their first home thanks to the skills they'd learned in his class. Each story, each smiling face, reinforced for Richard that he had made the right choice in changing his path. The wealth he had accumulated over his years in business seemed insignificant compared to the richness of community and purpose he now experienced. As midday approached, it was time for the official ceremony. Richard took his place at the podium, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. He saw hope, pride, and a sense of belonging reflected in their eyes, emotions he now felt deeply himself. "A year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I stood on this very spot with very different intentions. I saw this place as nothing more than a business opportunity, a chance to turn a profit. I couldn't have been more wrong." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This hub, this community, has taught me the true meaning of success. It's not about the money we make or the possessions we accumulate. It's about the lives we touch, the dreams we help fulfill, and the bonds we forge with one another." Richard went on to highlight some of the hub's achievements over the past year: the job training programs that had helped dozens of people find employment, the after-school programs that had improved student performance, the health initiatives that had made a real difference in people's lives. "But our work is far from over," he continued, his voice growing passionate. "Today, as we celebrate our achievements, we also look to the future. We're excited to announce that we'll be expanding our reach, starting with the Oakwood neighborhood." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Richard saw Amanda, the woman from Oakwood, standing near the front, tears of joy streaming down her face. We've learned that when we come together, when we support each other and believe in the power of community, there's no challenge we can't overcome. The story of this hub is proof of that. And it's a story we want to help other communities write for themselves. As Richard concluded his speech, the applause was deafening. He stepped back from the podium, feeling a sense of purpose and fulfillment unlike anything he had ever experienced in his business career. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activities: ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new facilities, performances by local artists, and countless heartfelt conversations. As evening fell, the celebration moved outdoors, where tables had been set up for a community dinner under the stars. Richard found himself seated between Sarah and Mrs. Patel, surrounded by the warmth and laughter of the community he now considered family. As he looked around the table, he saw faces that a year ago had been strangers, now as familiar and dear to him as any business associate had ever been. "You know," Sarah said softly, leaning in so only Richard could hear, "when I first knocked on your door, I never imagined we'd end up here. I was just hoping for a little more time, a little help. But you gave us so much more than that, Richard. You gave us hope and a future." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "No, Sarah," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me those things. All of you did. I may have provided some resources, but it was this community's spirit, its determination, that made all of this possible." As the night wore on and stars began to twinkle overhead, Richard found himself reflecting on the journey of the past year. He thought about the man he used to be, focused solely on profit margins and business expansion, and marveled at how much he had changed. The Hartley-Thompson Community Hub had become more than just a building or a set of programs. It was a testament to the power of second chances, the strength of community, and the transformative nature of kindness. It stood as a beacon of hope, not just for this neighborhood, but for others like Oakwood that were facing similar challenges. As the celebration began to wind down, Richard knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more communities to help, more lives to touch. But he was no longer the cold businessman who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss. He was part of something greater now, a movement of compassion, empowerment, and positive change. The story of Richard Hartley and the Elm Street community was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. And as he looked around at the faces of those whose lives he had touched, and who had, in turn, touched his, Richard knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The rich man who had once denied a poor family help had been transformed. He had been left speechless not just by their response, but by the journey it had set him on. And now, surrounded by the warmth and love of his new extended family, Richard Hartley looked to the future with hope, gratitude, and an unwavering commitment to making a difference in the world, one community at a time.